All right, in this video we're going to be talking about some different ways in which we analyze space in AP Human Geography. So just talking first of all about the term space, sort of when we talk about spatial analysis and looking at different sorts of patterns and processes and connections across space, we're analyzing sort of the physical distance and space between two things or two phenomena or two places. So we're not talking about outer space, but we're talking about sort of geographic space. So when we do that, we look at things like patterns across the space. Where do we see similar relationships? Where do we see similar features? We look at the connections and the relationships between two different places. And we look at and sort of compile places ultimately into what we would call regions, like we talked about last week, where we sort of look for commonalities within a geographic space that are unifying. So today we're going to be talking about some different concepts related to spatial analysis. One kind of quick thing to get out of the way is some terms kind of from Unit 1 that are helpful to describe places. So the term absolute versus relative location. So when we use the term absolute location, we're talking about characteristics of places that don't change. So oftentimes this will be represented in sort of latitude or in longitude or represent the specific site of a place. So this is absolute location, as in where something is sort of defined sort of in absolutist terms, unchangeable characteristics of place. Whereas relative location is sort of where something is in relationship to other things. So using something else to describe where something is, thinking about characteristics of place that might change, it helps us tell a little bit about the significance and the relevant context of where something is. So those are sort of the differences between the two, and have some connections to what we would call spatial analysis. Really the meat of what we're talking about today is how we look at kind of some of the relationships that exist between places and between different characteristics of places. So in the study of geography, we're going to frequently talk about sort of these sorts of connections. We'll talk about them in a cultural context when we talk about cultural diffusion and why language and religion and food and other elements of culture sort of spread across and throughout geographic spaces or don't spread. We're also going to be talking about migration a lot. So kind of the flows of people, looking at the relationships between the flows of people kind of to and from different places. Similarly, we're going to be doing the same thing with economic flows, and also just broadly looking at sort of general trends in politics and society, which has some obvious sort of connections to what we would call cultural diffusion. But ultimately, you do see increased levels of homogeneity or in sort of shared political culture in different parts of the world. So these are interesting trends that have kind of connections to this sort of analysis that we're going to do this year. So throwing out three really important terms. The first one is called distance decay. The second one is called time-space compression. These two can be seen as sort of separate, almost oppositional sort of concepts that are applicable sort of at different times when we're looking at culture. And then the gravity model is something that we're going to look at in the future that is pretty closely related to distance decay. So let's first talk about the concept of distance decay. So essentially this is a really, really easy term, I think, to wrap your head around. Basically it says that the closer that two things are geographically speaking, the stronger the relationship between those two things is. So, this can be, you can look at this a couple different ways. When we're looking at cultural diffusion, you're going to likely see cultural similarities between geographically close places, right? You're going to see language diffusing and religion diffusing and other aspects of culture diffusing in ways that sort of reflects this geographical relationship. So in general, we're more likely to see sort of strong similarities among places that are closer to each other than that are farther away. So this has been sort of diminished by a lot of the technological effects of globalization, things like the internet and social media, and even sort of older school forms of communication like TV and radio have made it so we have seen increased levels of social and cultural interaction between sort of geographically far away places. But in general, we do see this relationship existing. And if you apply this concept to migration, we're going to see kind of that same relationship, right? It might be easier to move to a place across the world than it was 50 or 60 years ago, but in general, we still see people moving pretty close by when they move. So to reflect this, this is a cool map of the word bear in different European languages. And it's kind of interesting. You can see a lot of similarities between geographically close places. So you have sort of the different language groups. Most of these are part of the same language family, but different language groups that sort of exist within the language family. And you can see a lot of the what we call Romance languages like Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese have similar names for the term bear, which some variation of orso or oso or something like that. You see a lot of the Germanic languages like English and German having similarities where they are using something with a B, bear, beer, bar, bjorn, something like that. And then you see languages that are derived more of the sort of Balto-Slavic language group that exists that we're going to talk about later in the year. Medved, Vedmid, I don't know. You can see it. A lot of similar sort of languages. So I think this is a cool relationship in terms of distance decay because you can see, geographically speaking, there is a strong relationship in terms of, the diffusion of this specific term, right? You're seeing a lot of similarities, and you can definitely see the relationship that physical distance has on at least the use of this one particular word, right? So distance decay is sort of reflected in that relationship where we see places close by having more cultural similarities. So the opposite of this, in some ways, is called time-space compression. So these two concepts are related, but related in sort of an oppositional way. So time-space compression says that there has been a strong reduction in the time it takes for something to get to one place to another. And obviously, again, like distance decay, this is a pretty simple idea. Most people sort of intuitively understand that. Now we have airplanes and the internet and things like that are making it easier for people and places, or people and ideas and things to spread from one place to another. But essentially, we have seen increases in technology that have sort of closed the gap that exists between two physically distant places. So it allows for increased levels of things like travel, cultural similarities, so kind of the diffusion of popular culture in different parts of the world, the flows of goods and capital, as part of sort of economic globalization. And like we said, levels of political and social cooperation are now more easily obtained or accessible than they used to be a while ago. Not always happening, obviously, but there are at least mechanisms in place that allow for these. So as a result of time-space compression, we do have a reduction of what we call distance decay, and the increased levels of things like migration and international travel and cultural diffusion. So as we talk about this throughout the year, we're going to be talking about all of the different political, cultural, social, economic effects of this. But it's also important to kind of point out, within this we have a lot of environmental effects too. Environmental effects of things like travel, like large amounts of travel, or the flows of goods and capital that have created pretty interesting and often harmful environmental effects throughout the world. So we'll get into more of that later in the year. Okay, so in the future, we're going to look at the gravity model, which is a very closely related concept to distance decay. You can see sort of a little bit of relationship of that here. So we'll talk about that tomorrow.